Deputy Clare Daly.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. I think I'm still somewhat in shock listening to some of the contributions from the government backbenchers about what a great budget this is, what a great creative achievement it's been for the Minister to grapple with issues in these difficult times, how we're all making sacrifices and we're about to turn a corner. Well, you see, the reality is that it hasn't been hard times for all of us. And it hasn't and won't be hard times for many people who have again escaped being tackled in this budget. And I'd like to make some points, maybe not so much about some of the points that are in it, which I will deal with, but also about the decisions that you didn't make, because it's quite clear that this budget, particularly the taxation elements of it, reflect a strategic decision to ensure that those who are wealthy in our society remain wealthy, to ensure that the state plays no role in terms of income distribution, and in actual fact the budget has been a mechanism for fuelling and perpetuating inequality rather than dealing with it. And even off the top of your head, you could look at a number of measures which could have been implemented, which would have altered the situation for the better. A 1%, a tiny 1% wealth tax on wealth over €1 million would have generated anything conservatively between 300 and 700 million, an amount roughly equal midway through that range of the hated home tax. A 1.5% increase in income tax on the top 10% would have yielded you an extra 400 million. You've made a great virtue out of the fact that corporation tax has remained untouched. Well, I don't celebrate that. I don't think that is a good thing. In actual fact, even if we were to implement the effective rate of corporate taxation, which is one of the lowest in Europe, and make sure that they did in fact pay that amount, we could generate an extra €2.3 billion per annum. If we raised it to the European average, not even go beyond the average, we could generate an extra €7 billion. And the reason why I mention some of those points, and I could use up all of my time mentioning others, areas like cutting the tax relief on pensions to the standard rate of 20%, as was pointed out to you by Social Justice Ireland, could have yielded over €500 million extra. And it is worth pointing out that a majority, over 80% of the beneficiaries of that benefit tax relief goes to the top 20% of earners in our society. So any of those measures, or indeed all of them, could have not only had a situation where you wouldn't have to implement the cuts that you made, but you could have reversed some of the cuts of previous years and stimulated some economic activity, because the only way in which this society and economy will recover is through job creation. And the idea that that job creation is going to come from this budget is quite simply laughable. The amounts of money that you've targeted, for example, the so-called 500 million tax relief package. Well, we know this is not going to work because we had the same thing last year. And the problems that you have are a couple. One, that you never know when the targets that you put forward are always greater than what is delivered at the end of the day, because you're relying on the private sector in that regard. And you don't know how much activity would have taken place anyway. And I think the home renovation scheme is a good example of that. You've had to move the date forward because loads of people who were going to get the work done anyway have cancelled orders with builders and rearranged it for the new year. So how actually effective that's going to be, we don't know. And the reality is that in order to really stimulate economic growth, there needs to be a serious state-led investment of public works, and that is not provided for in this budget. In actual fact, what we have is one law for ordinary people and one law for everybody else, and I think that was graphically exposed in the property tax debacle which was highlighted over the past number of weeks. And you've certainly lost the hearts and minds of the nation on that one, but you may have brought in legislation which allows you to take without their permission that money from people's pay packets and pensions and so on, but you haven't had the same enthusiasm for dealing with white-collar crime. And I'm a bit confused in relation to your speech earlier today. I note you have made some changes to section 851A of the Taxes Consolidation Act, but if I'm reading it correctly, I don't think you've actually altered that part where it was inserted into Section 77 of the 2011 Finance Act, an item which has been highlighted with you in parliamentary questions by me and repeatedly in the annual report of the Office of the Director of Corporate Enforcement, who have made it clear to you that because of that insertion in the Finance Bill of 2011, they are not actually able to pursue white-collar criminals in the way in which they could, because information which they need from revenue, they're not allowed to access it or get it, or if they can manage to get it, they're not allowed to use it. And they've highlighted that to you. They've asked you to bring forward legislative change so they can deal with white-collar crime, and from my reading of the measures that you've proposed in this bill, you haven't provided for that, and it's completely against open and transparent transparency in our taxation matters. Look, one of the most controversial aspects of this finance bill has been the assault on separated families, and probably because of the way in which things fall, separated fathers in particular as a result of your changes in the single parent family tax credit and so on. A lot of deputies have raised this point. I note that you have rolled back a bit. The message here really is that that is not enough. You are still discriminating against separated people. When couples separate, the costs are immense. The difficult emotional, financial difficulties when responsible parents negotiate maintenance agreements with their spouses, often in difficult circumstances, try to engage in responsible parenting, and you attack them in essence for that. There's loads of unanswered questions, even with your concession. If the principal carer isn't working and the allowance is claimed by the other parent, as you're now providing for, what happens if the principal carer returns to work? What happens about scenarios where parents share childcare 50-50 and guardianship and so on? What about families who are in dispute with each other and the difficulties there? There's no doubt this will lead to an avalanche into the courts, people renegotiating or reneging on maintenance order because they simply cannot afford to undertake those responsibilities. It's incredibly socially regressive, and I would urge you to abandon this proposal and stop discriminating against separated people.